Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philip Germain. I am the Vice President of Prevention and Employer Services for the Saskatchewan Workers' Compensation Board. I'd like to welcome everyone in attendance and those joining us online. What we're going to share with you today is the impact of the implementation of the enhanced rate-making model, which will come into effect for the 2018 premiums. We made a decision not to implement the model for the 2017 premium rates because, as you'll see, some of the impacts of the changes can be fairly significant on some industry sectors. Our board and administration felt it was important that we provide the opportunity to provide some education sessions related to what is exactly changing and how it might impact specific rate codes. So what we're going to show you this afternoon is not the 2018 premium rates. We're not going to attempt to guess what they would be because we don't have all the data to determine the 2018 premium rates yet. We will show you a comparison between the 2017 rates as currently calculated and published compared to what the rate would have been had we implemented the enhanced model in 2017. We have 2 hours for the session. Roughly an hour for the presentation and an hour for questions. We will take questions from the floor and online through the webinar. And if you realize you have a question after the session, you can email the question to askwcbsask.com. I'll put that email address up again later. So the agenda for this afternoon is a quick background on the Workers' Compensation Board, how it came to exist, and a high-level overview of how premiums are set. Then we'll go into the purpose of the rate model review, what the impact of those changes would have been had we implemented in 2017, and then we'll end with next steps. So why do you pay premium WCB premiums? Prior to 1915, there were no workers' compensation systems in Canada. Workers seeking compensation for injuries that occurred on the job had only one option: to sue their employer. Most cases were not successful, and in fact, most workers didn't have the resources to sue. But when the worker was successful, it often meant the demise of the employer, forcing them into bankruptcy. Neither of those situations were beneficial from an economic perspective. The Ontario government began to notice back then fairly dramatic increases in the use of their social security systems because workers, in the absence of a work injury insurance program, or their ability or their lack of ability to sue the employer, was left without any way to pay for medical or earn a living. These workers ended up on social assistance, elevating the cost of these programs. So the government, recognizing this, appointed a gentleman by the name of William Meredith in 1913 to study the issue and come up with an alternative solution to the current system of the day. Meredith came up with this notion of creating a workers' compensation system, which was really he'd gotten from Germany. The Germans had already implemented a compensation system, and much of what he brought back was from that system. The approach that he took is often referred to as the historic compromise. This compromise meant that workers gave up their right to sue in exchange for medical and wage loss benefits, and employers assumed the cost of that system in exchange for the protection from legal action. All jurisdictions across Canada adopted the model and has its own workers' compensation legislation. It's evolved over the years. However, the 5 principles upon which it was designed continue to form the foundation of compensation systems around the world. Those 5 principles include no-fault compensation, which means workers are paid benefits regardless of how the injury occurred. The worker and the employer waive that right to sue. There's no argument over responsibility or liability for an injury. The second principle is security of benefits, which means a fund is established to guarantee that funds exist to pay those benefits. The third principle is collective liability, which means that covered employers on the whole share liability for workplace insurance, injury insurance. The total cost of the compensation system is shared by all employers. All employers contribute to a common fund. Financial liability becomes their collective responsibility. Collective liability is common to all insurance programs. For example, your house insurance. You don't self-insure. Your house insurance is based on the collective experience of people with similar homes or risks that you have. The size of your house, the cost of your house, whether or not you have a fireplace, whether or not you have smoke detectors, whether or not you live in a floodplain. Those types of things determine, and then you're grouped with similar people with similar risks, and you share in the costs. And should something happen to your home, you don't pay for those costs yourself. The pooled premiums help pay for those. So that's collective liability. The fourth principle is independent administration. Meredith said that the organizations who administer workers' compensation insurance should be separate from the government. And the fifth principle was exclusive jurisdiction, which means only workers' compensation organizations provide workers' comp insurance. All compensation claims are directed solely to the Compensation Board. The board is the decision maker and the final authority for all claims. These 5 principles remain valid today in supporting an effective compensation system. So what's the process by which we actually determine an employer's premium rate? There are 3 basic steps that establish the amount of premium that an employer would pay. The first one is industry classification. In Saskatchewan, there are roughly 47,000 employers registered with the WCB. We take those 47,000 employers and we group them into what we call rate codes. You can think of a rate code as a risk pool. Those rate codes are based on the primary business activity. So the employers who have similar business activities. We have 50 rate codes in Saskatchewan, so 50 different industry groupings. Employers involved in similar business activity or risks are placed in the same rate code. For example, we place all employers involved in post-secondary education as their primary business activity into the G11 rate code. So all employers in G11 share in all the costs for all the claims that occur with all employers in that rate code. The same is true for other industries. So bankers are grouped together, healthcare is grouped together, etc. The premium rate is determined at the rate code level. The second step in the process by which we determine how much we have to collect in premiums is at the industry premium rate. We will go through this later in the presentation. So the bulk of the presentation is really how we establish that premium rate at the industry level. That's the rate model. So after the second step, we arrive at what we call the base industry rate. So every employer in the rate code would start off paying the same base premium rate, but recognizing that individual employers in that rate code might have different experiences. to hold individual employers accountable for their own experience, we introduced something called experience rating. And this program has two streams. The first one is the standard program. The standard experience rating program is designed for smaller employers who pay us less than $21,000 in premiums over the previous 3 years. This program is frequency-based, so it's based on the number of time loss claims that you've had. Depending on the number of claims, time loss claims you've had, you may be eligible for a maximum discount of 25% or a maximum surcharge of 75%. The second program is the Advanced Experience Rating Program, which is for the larger employers that pay us $21,000 or more in premiums during the previous 3 years. This program is cost-based. So it's based on the cost of claims, not the number of claims that you have. And if your individual claims experience is better than the industry average, you would be entitled to a maximum discount of 30% under this program. If your injury experience is worse than the average for your industry, then you could be subject to a surcharge of up to a maximum 200%. So there's a big swing there. So to recap, employers are placed in rate codes based on their primary business activity. We then calculate the industry premium rate based on the collective experience of all employers in that rate code. And finally, we apply experience rating to individual employers' experience to determine the final premium rate that you'd pay. So we'll move on to section 2. Why did we review this rate model? So why did we undertake a rate model review? So as part of our overall review of our financial system, we began by looking at the way we invest funds. So when we established the premium rates for 2017, what we're seeking to do was to establish the premium rate necessary to collect today to pay for all the costs for all the claims that occur in 2017. We don't pay all the costs in 2017, so if an injury occurs, some of those costs will happen in the future. We could pay out on some claims as long as 50 years. So if somebody's injured at the age of 14 or 15, it's a severe injury, they could collect benefits to the age of 65. So we'd have up to 50 years of costs with some claims. So it's possible for us to have costs that go well into the future. So what we're trying to do through this model is try to estimate the costs for the claims that would occur in 2017 as far out as 50 years and collect the present value of all those costs today through a premium rate. Because we're not spending all of that money, we invest those premiums. And those premiums are expected to earn a certain rate of return in order to fund the future costs that we have to pay. Kind of like a pension. So we undertook a review of our investment policy, the way that we allocate the investment funds into the various asset classes that are available. For example, equities, bonds, real estate mortgages. And following the review, we undertook something called an asset liability study, which simply seeks to look at how closely we match the income coming in from our investments with the cash flow requirements in order to meet future payments. So we have to achieve a certain rate of return that is assumed in the calculation of the premium rates in order to have sufficient funds to pay those costs. So part of the asset liability study was to see how closely our assets matched our liabilities. The actuary we hired was a firm called Eckler. And Eckler determined that we should probably review our rate-making model because it's an integral part of the revenue generation stream. So that was one reason why we reviewed the rate model. The second is we were hearing from employers, particularly in recent years, that the rate model was not reactive enough to changes in the experiencing industry. So it was for those two reasons the board asked us to undertake a review of the way in which premium rates are established, which is that second step in the rate-making process. So a little bit about the rate model in terms of key principles. What we sought to do in reviewing and enhancing the rate-making model was to balance these often competing principles. So on the one hand, we want to ensure that industries are held accountable for their own injury and cost experience. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we maintain collective liability. And a part of collective liability is to ensure that employers and rate codes are not unduly burdened by extremely expensive claims. If we increase accountability of the rate code, we decrease the collective liability, and vice versa. So we're really trying to balance those competing principles. On the other hand, we understand and recognize how important it is for employers to have some stability in their premium rates, so that you're not seeing rates dramatically increase or decrease from one year to the next. We seek through the rate-making model to generate rates that are quite stable, but at the same time we balance that against reactivity in the model. So if we make the model too reactive, we create volatility in your premium rates. They start bouncing around. If we create too much stability in premium rates, we withhold the reactivity in the model and we don't recognize current experience of employers and rate codes. So we're really trying to balance these four principles that underlie the rate-making model in the most transparent way possible. We'll talk a lot about the elements of the current model and the enhanced model with the attempt of trying to not make it too technical, because from our perspective it's important for us that you understand the process by which we would determine premium rates. So the fundamental things that we were trying to maintain as we reviewed the model, what we were really trying to do, as I indicated earlier, is to predict how much revenue we have to generate through the premiums in order to pay for the costs of the upcoming year's claims. So we're anticipating that at an average rate of $1.24, which is the average premium rate today in 2017, that money is going to be sufficient to pay for all the costs associated with all the claims that occur in 2017. So in conducting the review, we wanted Eckler to look at the credibility of the model from the perspective of it accurately generating the amount of premium revenue we would need to fund the system. No more, no less. We also wanted to make sure that the model was fair and equitable to all employers and that it be actuarially based, meaning we're making it as scientific as possible, removing the need to intervene in order to meet some of the outcomes that we're looking for, while maintaining certain principles like fairness and equity. So what were the key findings of the Eckler review? If you're interested, the paper that Eckler published on the rate model review here in Saskatchewan is posted on our website. And I'll post our website. It's www.wcbsask.com. Lots of W's. It's quite an extensive report, and there's quite a bit of it that's technical in nature, but it is there if you want to read it, review it, if you're having trouble sleeping. And also is the asset liability study is on the website as well. So both of those reports are there, and it's available for anybody to review. There's quite a bit of detail in both of those reports. So what Eckler actually determined in the process for determining the premium rate at the board level, what Eckler found was at the board level, the rate model that we have, the current rate model that we had, works well for generating the revenue requirements. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to use the word or the term board level or board level experience. And this refers to the collective experience of all employers in all 50 rate codes within Saskatchewan. So the current model works well in predicting the future costs and premiums required to fund those costs. What Eckler found, however, is that it needed some refinement because it was not doing as good a job when you got down to the individual rate code level. And quite frankly, over the years, they found that as a result of some of the changes in the economy, injury prevention practices, that some of the principles like accountability and reactivity had deteriorated and required us to intervene in order to maintain things like rate stability and reducing volatility in premium rates. And I'll explain some of that when we get into the details. Eckler made 7 recommendations, and I'm going to talk in some level of detail about all of them, but I want to cover off one particular recommendation now, and that is the second recommendation related to classification. So what Eckler noted was that in Saskatchewan, we have these 50 rate codes. And there are some rate codes that are very small. Some of these small rate codes have less than 50 employers in them. It's very difficult to predict claims and claim costs in such a small rate code. So by example, if you were to conduct a survey and your sample size is not very big, your survey may not be credible. So what Eckler noted is that we don't actually have a process to systematically review the classification system. Eckler said we ought to build that process that would require periodic reviews of the classification system with the thought of perhaps merging some of these smaller rate codes with other rate codes to create a larger sample size that would enable us to credibly predict the experience of the rate code. What the board decided is that they would like us to build that process, but in the meantime, there are no immediate plans to review the classification system or merge any rate codes. Any process we built would require a fair bit of analysis and include consultation with industries that would be impacted by any change that we would make. So as we build the process and start to implement that process, consultation with industry will be part of it. So industry impacts. So before I get into the details of the other elements of the rate model recommendations, I just want to reinforce that we're going to show you, what we're going to show you in the next few slides are the industry impacts for your rate codes, G11 and G12. Had we implemented the new model for 2017, and we'll compare that to the existing model. We don't know what the impact might be on the 2018 premium rates, as at this particular point in time, we don't have all the claims experience data to predict 2018 experience, what the 2018 experience might be. So what you're going to see is simply a proxy for the order of magnitude that you might be impacted by as a result of these enhancements to the system. The 2018 rates will be released in the fall and will include these enhancements to the model itself and will be updated for current injury experience. So we're going to compare 2017 rate current to if we had implemented the new model, what that would have looked like, to give you an idea of how the new model works and what the impact of that model might be on your rate code. So the first recommendation Eckler made was related to a concept called credibility. And it very much refers to what I was just talking about from a classification perspective. Credibility refers to the reliability to use historic experience in predicting future experience. So to the extent that you have a large enough sample size that is representative of what the future might look like, it can be reliable. But in the case of extremely small rate codes that don't have enough history or experience built up, just because they're small, they don't have enough employers or enough claims experience in that group, it becomes more and more difficult to predict. Under the current model, what we've been doing in order to mitigate this issue is that we've been adjusting the experience of the rate codes with low credibility by blending it with the board level injury experience. So what that helped to do was increase the reliability of the experience in those small rate codes. Eckler said that's not really what we should be doing. It doesn't really hold the industry very accountable for their own experience if you're intervening by applying the injury experience of the board level to the individual rate code. But Eckler recognized that they had to have sufficient experience in order to make the predictability valid. We needed more experience to be able to reliably predict what the future claims experience might be. Under the current model, for all industry codes, we calculate the average cost of all claims paid in the last 5 years. So for the 2017 premium rates, we use the 5 most recent completed years. So that'd be 2011 to 2015. All the costs paid in those 5 years are added together and a 5-year average is calculated. And that 5-year average is used to predict what the 2017 experience might be. Again, under the current model, we would calculate the average and we would adjust it upwards or downwards depending on what the overall injury experience was for all 50 rate codes taken together. Eckler said that we could continue to fundamentally maintain that underlying principle. We'll use historic averages to predict future experience. However, Eckler said that if a rate code was too small, you can't just limit it to 5 years experience. You should expand it to 10 years experience for those non-credible rate codes. So for an industry code to be credible under Eckler's definition, a rate code should have $16.5 million in claims costs flowing through it over the previous 5 years. So if you have $16.5 million or more in claims costs flowing through your rate code over the previous 5 years, you would be considered 100% credible. Eckler said that 5 years of experience is reliable in predicting future experience. For those rate codes that are 100% credible, They are reliable in predicting the following year's experience. However, if the credibility falls below 100%, less than the $16.5 million in claims costs, then we would need to blend a 5 and 10-year average experience. So for example, if your rate code had $10 million in claims costs running through, that equates to roughly 60% credibility. So for that industry rate code, we would use 60% of the average for the last 5 years and 40% of the average for the past 10 years. And that blended average is what we would use in order to forecast what the future costs might be. So we're using industry experience, and in some cases, if we don't have enough experience in 5 years, we expand it so that we use your own industry experience to predict what the future experience would be. Generally speaking, because we adjusted all of the experience with the board level experience for most industry rate codes, if a rate code experience is worse than the board experience, by us not blending your rate code with the board level rate code, and by looking at just your industry's 5 and 10-year cost experience, your rate would be increasing. So if your experience is typically worse than the board experience, by moving to this new model, you're going to probably see rate increases. If your experience is better than the board level average, then this would have the effect of reducing your premium rate. So let's look at what happens in G11 and G12 if we had applied the new rate model to G11. So G11 is, under the current model, is 49% credible. Their experience is better than the overall experience, which increases their costs using the current model. So you're going to be using, your experience is better than the overall board level. You're going to be using more of your own experience, so that causes your premium to go down. Does that make sense? Your experience, so under the current model, your experience is better than the board level. So the blending that we do would cause your costs to look like they're higher than maybe they should have been. By removing that blending and using your own experience, the net result of that is we are expecting less costs to, and as a result, your premium rate would go down by a penny. Under the enhanced model, by the way, you would be 56% credible, so we would need to use a blend of 5 and 10 years. Because your 10-year costs are higher than your 5-year costs, this actually would bump up your premium rate a little bit, but the net effect of removing the blending of the board level with your industry costs, the net effect of that is you're going down by 1 penny, 1 cent. For G12, there's really no change. While the experience for G12 under the current model, the current is 70% credible. G12 is 70% credible. Their experience is worse than the overall board experience, which decreases their costs in the current model. So G12's experience was worse than the board level experience. So when you remove the board level experience, you're going to see your costs go up. Under the enhanced model, G12 is 98% credible. The 10-year costs are slightly lower than the 5-year costs. So that is a net effect of decreasing the implementation of the new model. The balance of those two things is net zero. The next recommendation by Eckler had to do with the use of indicators to predict future costs. So I already just told you that we use a 5-year average to calculate what we expect in terms of spending in the future. Underneath that, or just before we do that in the existing model, we try to forecast the number of time loss claims. And then we attach an average cost per claim to forecast we attach an average cost per claim to the forecast of claims to determine the future revenue requirements. So we estimate how many claims you're going to have, time loss claims, the average cost per those claims to determine what the future costs might be and therefore the future revenue requirements. The problem with that, at least in recent years, is we've seen a significant decrease in both the time loss and total injury rates, and significant decreases in the number of claims. However, the costs of claims have not seen a corresponding decrease. In fact, we've seen some increases in claims costs. So using time loss claim counts as an indicator of the way costs might move is no longer valid because there's no positive correlation between the costs of how costs are moving and how injuries are moving. Claims are on a steady decline while costs are on a steady increase. What Eckler said is that you need to stop using the number of time loss claims as an indicator of what the future costs might be. Eckler suggested we stick to the 5 and 10-year average, but adjust the average by the change in the workforce. And change in the workforce simply means the percentage change in the number of workers covered in that particular industry code. So when we graph or map the change in costs with the change in workforce, we find a very, very strong correlation. It's almost 90%. It's way more predictive. It validated what Eckler was saying, that the movement of costs has a high correlation with the movement in the change in workforce. And time loss claims actually was a negative correlation in recent years. And so we accepted the recommendation, and we will no longer use time loss claims to predict future costs. We will rely on the change in workforce to adjust the 5 and 10-year average in costs. So if we see a 5% growth in your workforce, we will assume we will assume that average will grow by 5% as well. Because of the volatility in some of the premium rates, we were blending the current year premium rate with the previous year's premium rate. We're basically averaging the two. And the reason being is we were predicting these dramatic declines, so we were seeing these dramatic declines in injuries, and we were anticipating dramatic or similar types of declines in costs. That wasn't happening. The model wasn't bearing that out. So the only way to compensate for that, or one of the ways to compensate for that, is we blended your current rate, for example, 2017 rate, with the 2016 rate, so that we were generating enough revenue to pay for the cost of claims, future claims. So what would have been the impact of this change had we implemented it in 2017? The net impact for G11 would have been an increase of 1 cent. For G11, time loss claim counts have been decreasing steadily since 2010. So the model would have been anticipating decreases in injuries, decreases in costs. But we didn't necessarily see that. Using workforce will cause the rate model to expect an increase in claims liabilities that's more in line with the steady state or steady increase of FTEs in the rate code. Therefore, the adoption of the workforce indicator has a net impact of increasing by 4 cents. But when we remove what we do in the current model, so in order to promote rate stability, we're blending, for example, 2016 with 2017. By removing that blending of the rate, that removes 3 cents out of the premium rate. So applying the new model goes up 4 cents, removing the existing model out takes out 3 cents. The net effect is an increase of a penny. So going from using time loss indicators to workforce as an indicator, workforce change as an indicator, adds a penny to the premium rate of G11 had we implemented it in 2017. G12, that an impact would be down 9 cents had we implemented this. So the removal of rate averaging and the adoption of workforce results in that 9 cent decrease. So there's two things at play here again. So in G12, the past 15 years, there's been generally a decreasing trend of time loss claim counts, again, which would have caused us to expect lower costs. However, in 2015, the time loss claim counts have started to increase a bit in G12. That means the time loss claims caused the rate model to expect that increase in claims recently. But on the other hand, workforce has generally been increasing over the last 15 years in this rate code. But despite the increase in time loss claims in 2015, the workforce actually decreased in 2015 in G12. So there's lots of things moving in this rate code. At the end of it, what this means is that using workforce will cause the rate model to expect a slight decrease in claims liability that's in line with the slight decrease in FTEs in the industry. Therefore, the adoption of workforce as an indicator will actually decrease G12's premium rate by 9 cents. And the blending had no impact on this particular rate code. Costly claims pooling. The next recommendation that Eckler made and that the board accepted relates to costly claims pooling. So I said earlier, collective liability has two basic elements to it. First, that we are collectively responsible for all the liability associated with the injuries that occur in our industries. The second element is that individual employers should not be unduly burdened by excessively expensive claims. Under the current model, we have a claims cost capping element to it, but it is limited to pension costs only. When we talk about pension costs, these are the long-term claims that probably have some permanent loss of earnings that the individual will continue to receive some wage loss until the age of 65. Earnings replacement or pension is what we call it. Under the current model, if the cost of pensions related to an individual claim, if the cost of a pension related to an individual claim in the G code exceeds $90,000, we cap those costs at $90,000. And the difference between the $90,000 and the actual costs for that pension gets spread across all employers in that class. Now, the G class represents all employers who are in a rate code that starts with G. And there are five G codes in the G class. G11, post-secondary education. G12, elementary and secondary education. G22, which is health. G31, cities, towns, villages. And G51, government of Saskatchewan and ministries. So if you have a pension, a claim with a pension in it, and that pension is above $90,000, we cap it at $90,000, and anything above $90,000 gets spread proportionately across all rate codes in that class. The G class, so if an employer, as an example, if an employer in G11 had a claim with a pension related to $150,000, we'd cap the costs at $90,000, and the other $60,000 would be distributed across all rate codes in that G class, proportionately based on their payroll. So collectively, we share in that capping. Eckler said claims cost capping is a necessary part of a rate-making model. However, he said, the way that we're approaching it isn't quite right. First of all, the $90,000 is a fixed amount and has been in place for many years. It hasn't been indexed, increased for a long time. Eckler said that if you're going to have a claim cap, it should somehow have an indexing provision attached to it. So as things change and move, the cap costs can escalate with it. Secondly, he said, it doesn't make any sense that you apply only the methodology to pension costs. It should apply to all compensation-related costs, so all claims-related costs. Eckler recommended that we establish a multiple of maximum insurable earnings to determine what the claims cost cap should be. So what the board approved is that we would use 3 times the ultimate maximum insurable earnings, which in our system today would equate to just under $252,000. So that would apply to all claims costs, not just pensions. The second part of the decision by the board is that the difference between the claims cap, so approximately $252,000, and the actual costs of the claim would be spread across all rate codes, so at the board level, based on your claims costs. So now we've spread the collective liability beyond the class to every rate code in the system. So if you had a claim, for example, if you had a claim worth about $400,000, you'll be responsible for the first $252,000, and the other $148,000 would be spread proportionately across all 50 rate codes based on their proportion of costs in the system. So what would the impact to G11 and G12 be to this change in the rate model? So for G11, pension pooling, so the way we used to pool pensions, used to increase G11's rate code because the average pension costs were lower than the average in the G class. The net effect of this is a change or a decrease of 2 cents. So most of your pensions in G11 were lower than the average in the class. So now this is going to be more reflective of your experience, which is going to result in a 2-cent decrease. That's the primary reason why that would go down 2 cents, is you had low pension costs. In G12, however, G12 used to benefit from the pension pooling because it had pension costs typically over the $90,000. So now G12 is more responsible for these pension costs, because remember the cap is now at 252. So instead of capping it at 90, because if you have a bunch of pensions and those pension costs are over $90,000, you're going to be responsible for those pension costs up to $252,000. Same with any other claim cost. But the net effect of this for G12 is the rate would, for this particular element of the premium rate, had we implemented it in 2017, would have been a 2-cent increase. So G12 is going to own more of their pension costs that they have within their rate code. Allocation of fatality costs. The next recommendation dealt with fatality costs. Under the current system, we calculate an average cost per fatality for all fatalities that occurred over the last 10 years. And every rate code gets charged the same amount whether you had a fatality or not. The 2017 rates include a 4-cent charge for the average cost of fatalities for the past 10 years. Eckler said that's not very good accountability at the rate code level. What you should be doing is you should be holding rate codes that have fatalities more accountable for their own fatalities. Depending on the credibility of the rate code, we'd look at the average costs of fatalities over the past 5 years, or for low rate codes, the blend of the 5 and 10-year fatality costs. Now, the cost of fatalities can vary significantly. If it's a single person with no dependents, the cost of that fatality may cost the system $10,000, basically burial costs. However, if the cost of the death of an individual who was married, had several dependents, the related benefits to that claim could be upwards of $1.6 million. So there's a wide variance in terms of what a fatality may cost an employer or a rate code. So in order to recognize the diversity in costs of fatalities, the board has said that they will cap fatalities at the same as they do any other claim, 3 times the maximum insurable, which again is just under $252,000. Any costs above the $252,000 would get pooled at the board level. So let's look at the impact of this change to G11 and G12. G11, for the last 5 years, last full 5 years, 2011 to 2015, had 2 fatalities. Obviously, those fatalities were less than the average cost of fatalities and causing a decrease of 2 cents. Or 4 cents. So, it's 4. So these 2 fatalities mustn't have cost, I didn't look at them, but they mustn't have cost the industry hardly anything. Because it's basically stripping out the total cost of the 10-year average. So the 10-year average is 4 cents for G11. It's going to go down 4 cents by had we implemented this recommendation in 2017. For For G12, they only had one fatality, or they had one fatality, but obviously the costs were higher than the average because it's only going down a penny based on had we implemented this. So the costs were lower than the average, which were 4 cents across all industries, but slightly lower. So the impact of that is going down 1 penny. So I mentioned earlier that we could pay claims for up to 50 years. And under the current model, I also mentioned that we calculate a 5-year average, and that 5-year average includes the costs of all claims paid in that 5-year period. So in any one of those 5 years, and for the 2017 premium rate, we're talking about 2011 to 2015, in any one of those years, you could have claims that are 10, 20, 30, 40 years old, 50 years old, that you're still paying, you still have costs associated with it that go into that particular injury year. Under the current model, we don't care when the injury happened. If there are costs in that particular year, we are going to include it in the calculation of your 5-year average. The assumption being that in your industry, you're going to have similar injuries and costs that you had several years ago. Eckler said that's not necessarily true. Many of the employers may have changed. There's probably many employers that don't even exist. You could have combined. I think there's been consolidation in some of the industries, some of the employers. So in some cases, in some industries, many of the employers don't exist, but for sure industry practices change, technology changes, and the experience of employers in your rate code is different today than it was many years ago. Eckler suggested that we should be using a shorter experience period, somewhere between 5 and 10 years, to better reflect the experience of the industry. After our analysis, we determined that 7 years would capture approximately 75% of costs. So on average, the first 7 years of a claim captures 75% of costs. So instead of going back 50 years, in every one of those 5 years that we include in calculating the average claims experience, we would now only go back as far as 7 years. So in 2011, we will include the costs of all claims that occurred in the previous 7 years. The same thing for 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. And that 7-year experience will be used to calculate your 5 or 10-year average, depending on your credibility. So we're still going to have to pay the remaining 43 years worth of claims costs. So what do we do with those costs? What the board has approved is that we would take the remaining costs in those 43 years and we would pool them based on the claims experience that we would spread those costs proportionately across all 52 rate codes. So we take the 43 years worth of costs and then distribute it proportionately based on claims costs to all 50 rate codes. So what's the potential impact of this? If the majority of your costs are in the most recent 7 years, so proportionately, if the majority of your costs are in the most recent 7 years, then by dropping the 43 years in the calculation of the average, that's going to drive up your average, which will likely increase your premium rates. if the cost in those 43 years are greater than the costs in the most recent 7 years, by dropping those 43 years, you'll likely see a decrease in your average, resulting in a drop in your premium rate. So let's look at the two rate codes as an example. So for G11, your proportion of the 43 years of costs were higher than your proportion of the 7 years of costs. This is going to cause your premium rate to go down by a penny. The opposite is true for G12. In G12, your proportion of the 7-year costs are higher than your proportion of the 43-year costs. So your premium rate is going to go up by 13 cents for this particular element of the premium rate. And again, this is had we implemented it in 2017. The next recommendation that Eckler made had to do with the way we allocate our administration costs. So our administration costs, like most organizations, are divided into two basic categories, fixed and variable. Fixed costs are those that you incur regardless of what business you're in. So for the WCB, it's our building costs, our IT-related costs, our HR-related costs. The variable costs for us are all those that work on claims. So all the claims-related costs. Not the claims-related costs, but all the administration costs that work on claims. So under the current model, we assume that 10% of our costs are fixed and the remaining 90% are variable. The 10% fixed are allocated across all employers based on their percentage of payroll. The 90% variable are allocated or spread across all employers proportionately based on their claims costs. Eckler said that this is a great approach, but we should make sure that the percentages are right, which caused us to undertake an analysis and actually divide our costs into the fixed and variable categories. When we completed the analysis, we determined that our fixed costs are actually 30% of our admin costs, and the variable costs represent 70% of our admin costs. So we've adjusted the fixed component from 10 to 30% and the variable component from 90 to 70. And this is not unlike other jurisdictions. The 90-10 would have been considered more of an outlier than 70-30. So what's the impact of this change to G11 and G12? So before I review this specifically, generally, if you're an industry that has high payroll and lower claims costs, you're probably going to see an increase in your admin cost. What it says is that for employers with higher payroll or industries with higher payroll, they had not been necessarily covering off their proportion of the fixed costs. So for G11, the variable costs are going to go from 8 cents down to about 6. That's the impact of this change. But the fixed costs are going to go from roughly 3 to about 10. The net impact of that is you're going to go from about 11 to 16 for admin costs. So a net impact of about 5 cents had we implemented this in 2017. And again, the key driver there is that the main change is on the fixed side of it. In G12, however, they would have gone down by 2 cents. And that's because the variable costs would have gone from roughly 31 cents down to 23. And again, the fixed cost would have went from 3 up to about 10. So the net impact of that is it would have gone from roughly 35 cents down to 33. So a 2 cent change. So you can see we're kind of building the premium rate as we go along, and the impact of each one of these changes on the premium rate. So what we have here is a comparison of 2016 to 2017, and then 2017 current to 2017 had we implemented the enhanced model. So in G11's case, there would have been roughly a 5% decrease, or 2 cent decrease on the premium rate, from 41 to 39, or really from 2016 45 down to 39 cents. The net impact of that would have been about $134,000. There are 619 employers in this rate code, which means the average decrease would have been about $4,200 per employer. For G12, the net impact would have been an increase of about $100,000, $101,000. This would have represented a 1.7% change, or a 2 cent increase on the premium rate. There are 111 employers in this rate code, so the average cost would have been about $900 per employer. So what's next? So all the rate model education sessions are being recorded as webinars, and they'll remain on our website so you can go back and review them. We've thrown a lot of information at you, especially if you hadn't been to some of the earlier sessions where we've gone over the overall rate model, the new rate model. Both of those sessions are actually on the website. If you're wanting to go through this again, it's going to, as well as anybody else who maybe wasn't available today, they can go on the website and go through this webinar and hear the same information. It's available at our website at www.wcbsas.com. If you go back, because again, there's a lot of information to absorb here, and if you have questions after the fact, you can send those questions to askwcb@wcbsas.com. And we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. We've got more presentations in Saskatoon next week, so it may take us a few days to get back to you if you have a question, but we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I'm expecting that, within a few days, maybe a week, we'd be able to get back to answer your questions, whatever questions you have. The other reason for this presentation was not only to educate you on what the new model might look like, and but it was also on the impact. So comparing 2017 current to 2017 enhanced was really to give you a sense of what that impact might be. Again, we can't predict what 2018 will be. We don't have all the experience in. But you get a sense by looking at this what those impacts might be. And because there are impacts, we want your feedback on how we might handle those impacts. So we are going to have on the website a spot where you can go in and complete a survey and provide feedback on how we might transition the costs from the current model to the new model. And I'd kind of given you the impact, I think for G12 it was $100,000, and G11 it was $134,000 roughly, had we implemented in 2017. Those numbers might not be the same, they probably won't be the same for 2018. But as if we look to transition, how might we do that? And I know on the survey that we have online, we've put 2 suggestions up there just to kind of get the ideas flowing. One is, we just implement it now. And the impact, whether it's up or down, you just kind of bear the brunt of that change now. It's a one-time change. And then as you go forward, your experience will ultimately dictate whether your premium rates go up or down. The other option we offered on there is maybe we transition it over a couple years. So we take that dollar amount and we split it over 2 years, and we adjust your premium rate up or down during that transition period, just to mitigate the impact of costs going up or costs going down. And then we've kind of left it wide open, another option. If there's any other option that you can think of in terms of transitioning, we'd like to hear about it. And we're going to take all this information and ultimately figure out how we implement the new model, how we transition to the new model in 2018. And again, that feedback is going to be open until April 7th. There we go. The last final comment I'd like to leave with you before we open it up to questions is the easiest claim to manage is the one that never happens. WCB has been promoting injury prevention. WorkSafe has been around since 2002. Mission Zero has been around since 2008. And last year, 88% of employers had 0 injuries, which is higher than the last couple previous years. I think the year before it was 87, the year before that it was 85 or 86. So when we started Mission Zero, a lot of employers provided us feedback that it just wasn't doable, wasn't real. But every year employers keep proving to us that it is real. And every year they keep improving. So I want to thank all of you, because I know many of you are all hard at work trying to prevent injuries and manage those claims as best as you can, and we appreciate that. But again, I want to remind everybody that the easiest claim to manage is the one that never happens. So with that, I will leave that with you and now open it up to questions either from folks online and or in the audience. If you do have a question, if you could use the mic, because this is being recorded and we want to make sure that we capture your good questions and hopefully my good answer.
Just one question and one comment. Firstly, the question, I'm assuming for individual employers, the rebate and the surcharge process is the same?
Yes, for now the experience rating program will remain the same. That won't change. So this is just part 2 of the rate making model. So the experience rating piece will stay intact.
Okay, thank you. And second, just a comment, and we mentioned the pension cost for G12 being over $90,000. It seems incredibly high considering there's no teachers in that rate code. It's primarily, caretakers, educational assistants and stuff where average salaries are less than $40,000 for the vast majority. So to get pensions that are over $90,000, I'm just not sure where that would have come from or how that would have been calculated.
So we can get the information, and I'm just going to guess. So it's total cost. So once if the pension goes on, it's not per year. If the pension goes on for a long time, if somebody was injured at 20 years old, and severely injured and they were on a pension, the costs could accumulate over time. And what we're comparing you to is everybody in the G code. So even though you may not have a lot of pension costs, proportionally it could be more than other rate codes in the G code. So it just depends, but we can go in and look at that data and provide you and show you, here's what your costs are over the 90 compared to other rate codes.
With the concept of the balancing and so on, if, for example, you had a significant increase in claims and expenses on one of the rate codes within the G category, let's say the government category, what impact would that have on a category like G11? Would that bring it up or would it bring it down?
So if a rate code that you're so today, because the increase in cap is being, all claims over a certain amount are being pooled at the board level. I doubt one rate code going up would have a significant impact up or down on another rate code. So your experience, you're primarily going to be held to your experience. And more of it in a sense that all claims and all claims related costs are going to get capped at that $252,000, which there are very, very few claims that go above that. I think our data governance area looked at that, and there are less than 1% of claims that typically go over $252,000. So what's going to happen is most rate codes are going to become more responsible for their costs and have what's happening in other rate codes are going to have less of an impact on you. Any questions online? Any other? Well, if there's no other questions, again, there's lots of time available. I got my hand. We have a question coming. Okay, thank you.
So this is from a Kevin from the webinar. You had mentioned near the beginning the classifications might change. What kind of time frame do you anticipate to build? And my question disappeared. Build and then implement.
Right now, good question. We do not have a timeline for that. We haven't even started the process of building the process for kind of a systematic review of our classification system. And that's going to take research and time to just build the process. It'll take research and time to start analyzing rate codes, and then really only at that point. I mean, I'm taking a wild guess, but it's going to be at least beyond a year or two before we're out to industry to even start talking to them about what might be possible in terms of reclassification. But that's a really wild guess. Any other questions? If not, I would like to thank everyone for participating in person and online. We appreciate it. And for those traveling, I wish you safe travels home. Thank you.